We've all heard of women's intuition, right? Well, men have intuition as well. Intuition is so important when it comes to feeding ourselves and our families in our challenging food environment. This podcast explores a variety of topics related to a powerful, evidence-based eating framework called intuitive eating that integrates instinct, emotion, and rational thought. My hope is that it will help you finally break free of the perpetual diet cycle. This is the Men's Intuition Podcast. All right, well, welcome to another episode of the Men's Intuition Podcast. My name is Jeff Ash, and as always, I will be the host. And I'm excited to be here to talk about intuitive eating and nutrition and health and fitness and whatever it is that we're going to be talking about on each episode. So I never seem to really get enough of that. And of course, this podcast is a nice little outlet for me to talk and share and think about some of these different ideas and kind of put my own thoughts and stuff, organize my own thoughts a little better on each of these different topics that we're addressing. So if you haven't listened to the first episode of this podcast, I'd highly recommend that. In that, I kind of lay a foundation for what intuitive eating is and what it's not, lay out the 10 principles of intuitive eating and show how they kind of tie into each other. And so if you haven't listened, that would be really helpful so that you can get the most out of the episodes going forward from here. But in that episode, I also talked about the fact that I want each one of these episodes to kind of present a problem or a struggle or a situation, and then look at ways to address that particular problem, struggle, or situation in the context of intuitive eating and in ways that are going to help us to grow and benefit in a whole person approach to health. So we're not just going to fixate on physical health. We're going to be looking at all the different facets of health when we're addressing these different issues. So the issue that I have for today is I'm struggling with late evening snacking. And I think a lot of us can definitely relate to this one. I know I can at times and have in the past, much more so. And I think that any of us, especially those of us who have been on and off diets, can definitely relate to this. This may be just that we find ourselves having a difficult time with moderating our snacking in the evenings. Or it may be full-on binge eating episodes that we find ourselves engaged in. And so there is kind of a broad spectrum there. But many of the same underlying issues apply regardless of how severe the issue is for you as an individual. So let's start off by identifying this problem or the struggle, this situation here as we go into this. So on a regular basis or even nightly basis, we find ourselves kind of snacking into the evening. We may even find ourselves snacking in the middle of the night, and that can be a problem as well. Some of the common thoughts about this issue are things like, well, it's just a problem of willpower and discipline, or we just think, well, I'm just eating for emotional reasons, and I just need to not eat for emotional reasons. You know, we kind of tell ourselves that. Again, that comes back to the willpower discipline part. It could just be boredom. So we may just find ourselves bored and looking for something to do. And instead of finding something non-food related to do, we just say, I'll just grab a snack and kill some time that way. We eat a snack and we're still bored. So we grab another one, still bored, grab another one, and that can easily progress over the course of the evening. Now, have you ever given any thought to any other reason that you may be struggling with this issue? So those may be the primary reasons that you think you're struggling, but there may actually be another one. Now, in the interest of keeping this episode focused and not going too long, I'm going to briefly touch on these that I just mentioned, but then I'm going to focus some attention on what I think is one of the most common underlying reasons for this struggle or this problem, especially when it comes to those who are currently dieting or who have been dieting in the past. So let's start off by talking about willpower and discipline a little bit. So this concept typically comes from a dieting mindset. Here's your plan, here's your calorie target, your macro target. Maybe it's just a list of good foods and bad foods. Maybe it's a time frame that you're allowed to eat. If you're doing intermittent fasting or something like that, your job is to basically stick to the plan. And if you stick to the plan, then you'll get the results that the diet promises, right? If you want it bad enough, if it's important enough to you, you'll stick to it, right? That's where the willpower and the discipline comes in. So, if you can't stick to it, I guess you just don't want it bad enough, right? And that's what we're constantly told when we are engaged in these diets. And that's a strong message from diet culture. It's not the fault of the diet. It's not a faulty diet. It's not a bad diet. It's that you don't have the willpower to stick to that restrictive plan. So some attempt to take a flexible approach and say, oh, no, don't beat yourself up. You can always get back on track tomorrow, right? And that can be also interpreted as fall back in line. So again, it's putting that emphasis on you. You didn't have the willpower, you didn't have the discipline, and that's the problem. So technically speaking, I guess, yes, you quote, failed and didn't stay disciplined in sticking to the plan, but it's kind of like a boss expecting you to work 12-hour days or having a horrible work environment. The problem is that most of these plans are setting you up to fail. At some point, you aren't going to be able to take it anymore. You can't work 12-hour days for your entire life. At some point, there's going to be a breaking point, and then you just can't keep doing that anymore. Or working in a horrible work environment, at some point you just say, screw it, I'm out of here, and you go find another job. And that's often what happens with these diets, is that it's so difficult to stick to it long term. And we can have willpower and discipline for just so long, but eventually our body is going to fight back. The main reason for that, as I talked about in the first episode, is that we have these innate built-in drives to seek out food when our body needs energy. And when we continue to suppress that and fight against it, our body begins to fight back harder and harder. And so it becomes really difficult to continue to do that. And just like with a work environment where you are working too many hours and not giving your body adequate rest, at some point your body is just going to say enough, whether it's illness, whether it's a mental breakdown or something like that. So the problem is that most of these plans, as I said, are setting us up to fail. And this is why people continue to go back to dieting over and over and over again, and why you may have found yourself going back to dieting over and over again, and maybe even the same diet. You think it worked because you lost some weight in the past, and so you just need to get back to that. And maybe, this time I'll be more disciplined and have more willpower. The problem is that you're still going to run into that same underlying issue, which is that it's not sustainable for a long period of time. And this is that diet mentality that I talked about in the first episode, that first principle of intuitive eating, rejecting the diet mentality. And this is why it's so important to reject that, because it focuses so much on this willpower and this discipline and ignoring the signals inside your body. Now, when it comes to emotional eating, this is also quite common. You're stressed at the end of the day, right? And it could be a combination of things: work, family, relationship struggles, financial struggles, all kinds of different things going on. And we end up using food as kind of a coping mechanism. Now, that's okay unless it's our primary coping mechanism. And that's where a lot of people run into issues. It's okay to use it to cope from time to time. You had a hard day, you're sad, you're upset, maybe a breakup or something like that, and you sit down with a bowl of ice cream. Nothing wrong with that, nothing wrong with eating emotionally. But if it's your go-to to grab food when you are in an emotional state, then that can become a problem over time. It's a problem if it's the first thing that we go to when we're stressed or worried or frustrated, that kind of thing. So we'll do some entire episodes on this topic for sure, definitely with some guests as well. But ultimately, if this is our issue, we want to explore ways to meet those needs that don't involve food, because food is never going to address the root underlying issue with emotional eating. It's only going to mask it for a very, very short period of time. And it often even exacerbates the issue. So we find ourselves eating for emotional reasons, and then later we beat ourselves up because we didn't address what was actually going on. And then we feel even worse about the situation than we did when we started. Ideally, we want to get to that root of the issue. Now, when it comes to boredom, is there something else that you can do when you're bored? So that would be a consideration if you've identified your main problem as boredom eating. Do you have any past hobbies or activities, or current ones that you have, that you enjoy? Maybe there's some in the past that you've kind of moved away from that you could kind of revisit. And that might be a way to help with some of this boredom eating, finding something to do that doesn't involve food that's going to stimulate your brain. Is there anything involving movement and physical activity that you could do? This is another great one that you can incorporate, whether it's going for a walk or maybe working in your exercise time to that time of day so that you're stimulating your brain and your mind in a way that doesn't involve food. Are there things that you've been neglecting or putting off that you could take care of? This is another thing to consider too. Is there housework that you could do? If you're really bored, go take care of some of the things around the house that maybe you've been just putting aside. Home repairs. Finish that project that you started 6 months ago that your wife keeps asking you about. Maybe it's something like that. Maybe those kinds of things could be some ways of addressing it. Obviously, none of these are a simple fix, but just kind of start thinking of different ideas that might help you in the area of boredom that you could do rather than, again, using food to kind of put a Band-Aid on the situation just for that period of time temporarily. Often those other things are going to be more beneficial to you anyway. You're going to find more joy and satisfaction and pleasure in those things too. And so really it's kind of a win-win situation. All right, but there is also another very common underlying cause for these late night issues with eating, and that is hunger. And that's definitely not something that dieting addresses. It doesn't tell you, well, maybe you're hungry, you should eat something. You might actually be hungry. I know it's kind of like this mind-blowing experience to think in those terms, but that may actually be the cause. And in fact, in many cases, I find that to be the underlying issue. This is why principle number 2 of intuitive eating is so important. Honor your hunger. And it's because hunger fluctuates day to day based on the needs of the body. Higher or lower levels of physical activity will impact your level of hunger. And since that changes day to day, it only makes sense that your hunger would change day to day and the energy needs of your body would change day to day. Your exercise activity too. So it could depend on what kind of exercise that you're engaged in. So if you have a kind of a structured training schedule or workout schedule that you follow, on cardio days, you might find that you are either hungrier or less hungry. Weight training days, you might find that you're hungrier or less hungry than other days. Maybe you have some high intensity interval training that you're incorporating in that. You find yourself hungrier on those days or less hungry. Again, each person's going to be a little bit different. Each one of these forms of exercise does tend to have a little bit of a different impact on our appetite. Sometimes it can increase our appetite, but other times it's interesting because these forms of physical activity can also help to regulate our appetite and get it back to kind of a normal state, a healthy state for where our body naturally wants to sit. So keep that in mind also. That's one of the things I love about encouraging movement. So it doesn't have to be formal exercise, just any kind of movement is going to be beneficial for your body, and it's going to help your body to better regulate all of the different systems that are going on inside your body. So different amounts and forms of movement outside of exercise activity are also going to impact your level of hunger, and even non-movement things. So stress where you're fidgeting more, tapping your foot more, squirming in your chair, all of these kinds of things that aren't necessarily like real active kinds of movement, those things expend energy also, and they can impact the amount of energy that you expend over the course of the day and thus impact your levels of hunger from day to day. So as that fluctuates, again, this is why it's so important that we recognize that our hunger is going to be different on each day, and why intuitive eating has it as one of the core principles of honoring that and learning to recognize that. So when we allow our hunger to get too strong by inadequately feeding ourselves throughout the day, makes it really hard to then eat mindfully, listening to our hunger, our fullness, and the various satisfaction cues that we have in our body. This is why it's so important to address the hunger issue. Now, one of the things that I find really helpful in this, and this is not really a principle of intuitive eating per se, but I find that it can be really helpful for my own life, and my clients seem to find it really helpful as well, and that's to add in a little bit of structure. So structure and intentional eating throughout the day can be really helpful, especially when you're first getting started, as it kind of helps you to get into kind of a rhythm and a flow, and it can also help you to identify your hunger and your fullness a little better. Each person's going to be completely different here. A good general rule of thumb that I like and find beneficial for a lot of people is, the 3 meals a day and maybe a couple of snacks, maybe 3, depends on what you need and the individual again. This is not a hard and fast rule. Definitely don't let it become a rule, but a little structure can be helpful in a lot of different areas of life. In our hectic society, it's really easy to forget to eat or skip eating altogether in the interest of productivity. That's really common. Oh, I'm just going to work through lunch. I'm too busy. So we think that skipping a meal and working through lunch is going to make us more productive, when in fact, it's probably going to backfire, at least if that becomes a habitual pattern for us. I don't have time to stop and eat or to eat a proper meal or snack. So we just grab something, just shove it in our mouth and go about our business. Taking time to prioritize feeding ourselves can go a long way in helping us to better manage our hunger all over the course of the day. So keeping ourselves well fed really helps with a number of different things. It can help provide the energy we need. That makes sense, right? Putting energy in our body. Our body is doing things throughout the day. It needs that energy. And so it provides that energy for us, both physically, but also mentally. So often when our brain is starting to get foggy or not to function as well, that can be a sign that we're just not feeding ourselves well throughout the day. It also helps keep our energy levels more even, so we don't have those slumps where we have those highs and those lows and feel like we're crashing throughout the day. And then often we address that by just popping some caffeine, right? Getting a cup of coffee, an energy drink, something like that, when really what we needed is food. We didn't need a stimulant. Also, keeping ourselves well fed can help prevent us from getting to kind of this panic mode level of hunger, or this urgent level of hunger. And so that's important as well, because when we find ourselves in this sort of panic mode or this urgent level of hunger, this is when we find ourselves eating in ways that don't really align with what we kind of would like for ourselves or what our body needs. We don't give it a chance to respond to the hunger and tell us that it's full, because we're so hungry. We just kind of eat in this sort of panic mode. And then it's really easy to eat past fullness. It's also really easy to miss satisfaction when we eat that way. And it can also help us to manage those late night snacking occasions. So this is where that structure can really help. So to be clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with eating later in the evening. I think I mentioned this earlier on. If you're hungry, it's definitely not a bad idea to eat something, right? That's your body telling you it needs energy for whatever reason. If you're not hungry, though, but you find yourself looking for something to eat, and I think this is where a lot of times people find themselves, taking a moment to simply pause and ask yourself what you really need before grabbing something to eat can be really helpful. So it may be that there's a specific taste that you're looking for. Maybe it's something sweet or salty, and that's okay. So it may be that you're not particularly hungry, but you just want that taste. That's okay. Is there an emotional need that's not being met at the moment? These are questions that you can kind of ask yourself when you take that short little pause. And that pause is not like a 5 or 10 minute pause. It's just a quick little check in with yourself. Say, hey, I'm really hungry. Am I just in the mood for a little something sweet? Is there emotional need not being met? Or maybe you just need to go to bed and get some sleep. This is one that often clients are like, oh yeah, I never really thought of that. But yeah, when I find myself wanting to eat at midnight, and I have to get up at 6 o'clock the next morning, maybe I should have just gone to bed a little earlier and got the sleep that I need. And that would actually be more beneficial to me. And it also helps work through this issue with this late night eating. So being mindful of what you actually need in a moment can really help to redirect your attention to actually meeting the real need rather than masking that need with food. And just being mindful, taking that short pause, asking yourself those questions can be really helpful. Remember, it's still totally fine to eat the food. You may take that pause and say, you know what, I'm not really hungry, but this particular food just sounds good to me right now. And then you go ahead and eat it. Now, again, it comes back to habitual patterns. If you find yourself eating when you're not hungry habitually all the time, every time that it's later in the evening and you pause and ask yourself this question and you say, no, I'm not really hungry, but I'm going to go ahead and eat. That's where you need to start to dig a little deeper and find out, hey, what's really going on here? Why do I keep gravitating toward eating when I'm not hungry rather than finding something else to address that underlying need? So just keep that in mind. But again, it's totally fine to just eat the food. And in fact, I do that myself often. I'm in the mood for something sweet. I'm not really hungry, but I just want that sweet taste or a salty taste sometimes, whatever the case may be. And that giving myself that unconditional permission to eat that we talked about in one of the other principles of intuitive eating is a way to put that into practice. Allowing yourself to eat that food and then just moving on. And you often find that it doesn't take much to be satisfying in that case. When you're looking for something sweet, a single piece of chocolate is often enough when you've given yourself the unconditional permission to eat that whenever you want it. But in the end, it's really all about these habitual patterns, as I mentioned. So as we kind of wrap up this short episode, I'm trying to keep these episodes relatively short. But as we wrap this up, let's just kind of be reminded of a couple of key points from what I was talking about today. Number one, the food itself is not the problem. Again, in the first episode, I talked about often we look at these things as the problem. The late night snacking is the problem. The eating the food for emotional reasons being the problem. But in fact, it's just a symptom of what's actually going on deeper down. So we want to look at what's going on deeper down, driving me to eat later at night. If it's hunger, maybe I need to restructure my day. If it's for emotional reasons, maybe I need to figure out what it is that I need to do to better meet those emotional needs and that kind of thing. Something else I did want to mention is that, quote, junk food. I don't like that word, but we'll use it here because I think a lot of people are familiar with that and use that word. Or sugar is also not the problem. So you may find yourself gravitating towards these kinds of foods, these more processed kinds of foods, snack type foods, sweet, sugary foods. Again, those are not the problem. Those are a symptom of what's going on below the surface. And I find that people often try and address this by cleaning out your pantry, out of sight, out of mind, that kind of mentality. And really, that's more of like a Band-Aid. Again, you're taking it away so that you don't see it there, but you're not addressing what's really going on beneath the surface. If you address what's going on beneath the surface, then you eventually get to a point where you can have these things in your house and you just eat them and enjoy them whenever it's the right food for the right moment. And when it's not, they sit there on the shelf with no magic power to draw you in or suck you in to eat those things excessively or anything like that. Identifying what you truly need in the moment and then trying to meet the true underlying need is really what's ideal here. So again, it might be an emotional need that food won't meet. It might be stress that you need to work on managing better. It could just be sleep habits, might be boredom. And there may be something better that you can find to do with your time to stimulate your brain and kind of work through that boredom. And it might just be, as I pointed out, that you're hungry, to where that food, that structure, and being more intentional about feeding yourself well throughout the day can be a really simple way of addressing that issue. So again, there's no quick fix for any of this, but the key thing here is to identify what the real reason is for the late night snacking and then address that, whether that be finding some other way to meet that need or actually eating better throughout the day, eating more, feeding yourself more consistently. So I hope that episode has been helpful to you. And as always, if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at intuitive.eating.men or at my website, hopedrivesme.com. You can reach me there as well. And I'd love to hear feedback on the podcast, questions that you may have about this episode or other episodes. And I'd love to have ideas for future episodes that you would like me to address, whether it's a problem, a struggle, an issue of some kind. And I would love to try and help you work through those things through this podcast. Thanks.